All right, everyone. We're going to jump into our next topic here, which is data lifecycle management. Now, this is an important one here, so we're not necessarily talking about protections per se. What we're talking about here is how long are we going to keep our stuff around? And, well, why do we care? So let's jump right in. So data lifecycle management, what is it? Well, it is a way of ensuring data permanently exists for an exact period of time as determined by a corporate compliance policy. Now, what does this truly mean? Well, again, we're making sure that data exists inside of our tenant. So again, we're looking at email, documents, whatever it may be. They're going to exist for an exact period of time as determined by a corporate compliance policy. Corporate compliance policy says that we keep all data around for X years or whatever it may be. And why do we care about this really? And why do we want to keep the data around? Well, the biggest factor here is eDiscovery. So we're going to look at eDiscovery here towards the end, but understand this before we dive into this even further is that eDiscovery is the piece that should drive retention and deletion of data. Now, moving through here, why do we care? Well, litigation could be good or bad. As an organization, okay, especially during legal proceedings, as an organization, we say our corporate compliance policy is we keep all emails around for 5 years. Now, if we have nothing actively retaining data or deleting data, and they, on the other side, basically say, hey, we want a copy of all emails that was sent to so-and-so from so-and-so during this time period. And all of a sudden you look at, and you start looking at your data and you realize that, well, we don't have anything actively retaining it. It has been deleted. Ooh boy, we're going to have some problems. If you do not adhere to your corporate compliance policy, or if you do not have a corporate compliance policy, you are setting yourself up for a lot of problems. Now, anybody who's ever gone through any type of legal proceedings would know that this is just a nightmare of a scenario, and it's generally not the most fun. However, these policies here are designed to protect the organization. So we are retaining data. So again, let's just say some of the worst things that could possibly happen. Again, we had we'll just say some sort of industrial espionage. That's a thing that actually happens, and I know it's kind of a weird thing to hear, but it is definitely a thing that needs to be worried about. So in this instance here, what if we had somebody who was sabotaging us? They were an employee and they went in and just leaked all of our blueprints to the internet and they just emailed it out to everybody. And then they went in and deleted all of their emails. Well, if we don't have a retention policy, all of that data is probably gone, right? Well, there may be ways of getting that back. It really, really depends. But retention policies, as the name implies, retain data for a period of time. We're going to dive here a little bit further into what retention policies actually do, but let's look at the different types of retention policies that are available inside of Office 365. There's a couple. There's 3 main, but they have obviously subsections here. For the most part, what we normally see here is going to be service-side retention. So this is very broad brushstrokes, the entire service, all Exchange email, all SharePoint, all whatever. Or we can be a little bit more specific in here where we can say everybody that is, these people get this type of retention. And we're going to retain data for, let's just say, 5 years. Okay. And we're going to talk about what retention truly is here in just a minute. But the policies inside of Office 365 allow us to do service side, which is the entire service. Again, very broad brush strokes here. We have static and adaptive scopes. Static scopes, as I said, those are going to be, this hardwired specific group of people or the entire service. Generally speaking, the best practice is to do the entire service or specific SharePoint sites, but really don't change too frequently. However, if, for instance, we have a need, as our complexity for retention grows, we'll say grows, not goes, but we'll say as it grows and it starts getting more complex, let's just say, for instance, every regular employee in the organization has a retention of 5 years of data, and then we delete all of their data. Well, then that person, we also have another policy that is all managers in the organization, we keep data for 7 years. So obviously there's a disparity there between the two. So in this instance here is that that one of those users who was under 5 years, they were a regular employee, they got promoted to a manager. Well, now they need to be moved. So as opposed to individually moving it, we can use adaptive scopes. And we'll look at these here because these are actually very useful. We can also do SharePoint sites that have a specific attribute or something like that in it. These are actually quite useful. We'll get to those here in just a little bit. So we talked about server-side retention. They have the static versus adaptive. Then we have retention labeling. Now this can be a little bit confusing here because very similarly to the way the sensitivity labels work, retention also can be labeled in a little bit different of a manner. And we'll discuss this as we go. We can do manual or automatic labeling. We'll get to those in time. And this really kind of comes down to the idea of a much more complex retention schedule. We'll get to that in time. Litigation or in-place hold. So these are the three major ways of doing it. A litigation hold is that, hey, you have been named in a lawsuit inside of the organization for whatever reason. You and the organization have been named in a lawsuit. Boom. Immediately at that point, we're going to put your account on in-place or litigation hold. It's honestly called in-place holds nowadays. It used to be called litigation holds, so I still do reference this, but it's the same exact concept. So at this point in time, we put everything on a freeze on your mailbox or whatever location that we wanted to do, and we hold that data. And it is frozen there. Your entire mailbox or the entire tree is frozen, and you can't delete that data. You can't do anything with it. It is there during the litigation. Once the litigation's over and it's been settled and everything, that litigation hold goes away, and then the rest of that data depends on what happens to it, but it will go away eventually. We'll talk about in-place hold when we look at eDiscovery as well, and there is another way of doing it is by specific data requests, if you will, but we'll get to that in time too. So what is the purpose of retention and really kind of how does it work in the back end? Well, let's look at it here. Retention policies allow us to do any or all of the following. Retain data for a period of time, delete data after a period of time, retain data and then delete data after a period of time, retain data forever. Now, again, as you see on here, these are 4 distinct, unique spaces. That last one there just gives me the shivers. Retain data forever, all data forever. That's just a terrible idea, of course. But looking at what we're doing here is we can delete data after a period of time, retain it for a period of time, or retain it and then delete it. The most common one is the third one. Is that, okay, let's just say we have a 5-year retention and deletion. So that means in our organization, all data is retained for 5 years and then deleted. So no data is older than 5 years. However, we have no data that is deleted between now and 5 years. We can delete data after a period of time where we're not actively retaining the data. It is just going to be deleted after a period of time, so no data in the organization is older than 5 years. And then we can retain data for a period of time. So let's just say we have a retention policy for retain data for 5 years. Well, during that 5 years, all of that data will be retained and stay around for 5 years. And then after that 5-year period, if they do get deleted, it'll go away. If not, then it'll stick around until somebody deletes it. So we have these 4 unique scenarios here. Now, all of these have retain, obviously, except for the deletion piece here, but what the heck does retention actually truly mean when we're defining it? Keeping data around even after deletion, either by user or by system. So remember that espionage demonstration, or example I gave you? So again, if somebody were to leak all of our stuff out and then delete their email, well, in this instance, if we are retaining all data for 5 years, that data, even if they delete it, will still stick around in some form or fashion, and I'll show you what that truly looks like. And we can actually stop it from being deleted. Deletion is removing the data completely. This one makes sense here, is that it is completely destructive deletion. It is gone completely from the organization, never to be seen again. That's a little bit scary for some people, but again, from a legal perspective, if we say 5 years and that's all we have and that's all we will ever have, then that's it. So you got to look at it here, but this is how retention policies and what they can do. Okay. Now let's look at the principles of retention. Okay. So there's 4 different sections of it. Is that if there's ever a conflict, so if a piece of data has multiple conflicts, retention wins over deletion. Then longest retention period wins. Then explicit wins over implicit for deletions. Then, finally, shortest deletion period wins. So if there is a conflict where something needs to be retained or deleted, and let's just say that in the back end, we have a piece of data that is ready to be deleted, but they are on litigation hold. Well, number 1 there would immediately do it is retention wins over deletion. Okay, so retention, that overriding litigation piece, will always win over that deletion policy. So even if that data was scheduled to be deleted after 5 years, but you have put a litigation hold on, think about that on top of it. And as long as that litigation is hold on there, it will never go away. But as soon as you remove that litigation hold, then the retention would happen and that data would be deleted. So again, same concept applies as long as retention period wins. Let's just say we have 2 pieces of data, or excuse me, 1 piece of data, but 2 retention policies, and they both apply to it. One's for 5 years, one's for 7 years. Longest retention period wins, 7 years. Explicit over implicit. Concept applies here is that if I were to put a explicit label, let's just say, on a document that says keep it for 10 years, and then we have a service side retention policy for keep it for 5 years and then delete, that explicit will win over the implicit. And then finally, the shortest deletion period wins is that we have a deletion period of data that is, 3 years or 5 years, and they both, again, conflicting over a piece of data. Obviously, the shortest deletion period will win there. So these are the principles of retention here. These are important to understand, and generally you don't see these too frequently. The one that I gave you, the first one around litigation hold, that's one you see probably the most frequent, to be honest with you. All right, let's talk about it. How the heck does this work in the back end? So again, we're talking about retention and we're keeping the data around, sure, but really, how's the nuts and bolts work on this? Well, in Exchange, we have kind of a multi-stage deletion effort. Okay, we have our mailbox. We hit delete. It goes to the deleted items, which we can see inside of our mailbox, and then it goes to the recoverable items if we delete it from our deleted items. And it sits in the recoverable items there, which is think of it almost as a subsection of your mailbox. And that recoverable items there will stick around for a period of time. If there is no retention policy or anything like that, 14 days. So this is where a user can go in and restore it if needed. And I gave you a demonstration of what that looks like in our Exchange section there, where we can restore data if somebody deletes it. But in the instance of somebody wanted to delete, again with that sabotage instance, where they've deleted everything out and then deleted their mail, yes, it would be deleted from the deleted items, which would go into the recoverable items folder. The recoverable items folder you cannot delete from with a retention policy on. All retained items will stay in the recoverable items folder until system deletion and cannot be purged. Okay, so the users cannot delete their mail. So we are good there in terms of covering ourselves from data leakage. And really what I mean by that is data, we'll say data obfuscation, if you will. So it's trying to, I'm trying to cover my tracks. I want to delete everything that I've done and then kind of come back in there and pretend like that never happened. Well, I can't do that because I am retaining the data. That is what retention holds do. Now inside of SharePoint, we have a similar manner. If I delete a file from SharePoint, it goes to the recycle bin, and then if I delete it from there, it goes to the site recycle bin. The site recycle bin is kind of that third stage, recoverable items folder, same concept. And literally the exact same thing as Exchange works. It's the same concept here. SharePoint OneDrive fits into this category here. So all retained items will sit in the site recycle bin until system deletion and cannot be purged. Same exact concept applies here. All version histories are also retained during that period. So again, if there's 800 version histories of it, we are going to retain all 800 versions of it. Okay? So on the back end, this is how it works. So remember, when we're looking at data inside of Office 365, it is always located in one of 2 sections, Exchange or SharePoint. That's it. That's the only places you can actually store data really inside of Office 365 that users' data can be stored in. It's in Exchange or SharePoint. Now, Teams also fits into this. There's lots of different places, of course, that we can recover data from, or excuse me, retain data, whether it be from Teams potentially, or maybe some other locations, whatever it is. But we can do those as well. But again, you got to think about it. They're most of the time tied to the Exchange mailbox or to the SharePoint/OneDrive site. So in the back end, that's how it works. Now, let's look over here and kind of break down the different sections. So we have service-side retention. This is the most popular and easiest one to set up. This is because they're very broad. All Exchange mail is retained for 5 years and then deleted. This is an example of a static scope, but we can also do adaptive scopes. So static scope here is a entire service or specific group of people. It's not really designed to change frequently. It's not modular. It's not really designed to be kind of adaptive, so to speak. That's why adaptive scopes exist. These are based on AD attributes or SharePoint site attributes. So an AD attribute could be, something in your Active Directory. This could be any one of the custom attributes. This could be again, going with that example that, hey, I was a regular employee and I was promoted to manager. Well, I can have an adaptive scope that is manager, and inside of my, we'll say, title, if it says manager in there, then you're going to be a part of the adaptive scope for managers, which will then move you over from the regular employee to the manager one. And that's all happen on the back end just by editing some AD attributes. Same thing with SharePoint sites. We can get creative with these here where we can use this SharePoint name. So it could be like we want to do a naming governance to SharePoint sites. We have like a 2-digit, we'll say a 2-digit department code followed by a site name. So this could be HR dash, whatever. And we can have, if it has HR in it like this, at the beginning of it, then we are going to retain that data for 10 years. And then maybe we'll have one for accounting that's like AC. I don't know, whatever. Just saying that's another attribute that we can use. So this is server-side retention. This is, like I said, most of the thing that you'll see the most. However, we also do have retention labeling here. Just as I said, very similar to the way that sensitivity labels work out, is that we have a lot more, we'll say, modularity, if you will. But these are really used when the retention system is more complex. Here's an example. Public data is retained for 10 years while confidential data is retained for 3. So in this instance here, this is a little bit more complex because public data could exist anywhere. It could be in any location. But what we're looking here for is the public data in its own right. That could be in email, that could be in SharePoint, OneDrive, or wherever. That, wherever it is, needs to be flagged and labeled for retention for 10 years, while confidential data is for 3. Okay? So it doesn't matter of those. Here's the thing that I like about retention labeling is that we don't have to necessarily look for data classifications. We can, of course, but we can also be more specific in our SharePoint retention. So we can put this inside of a SharePoint site, and everything inside of that site will inherit. This is a big difference between sensitivity labeling, the group labeling, as well as these retention labeling here. Retention labeling does inherit. Sensitivity labeling does not inherit. So if I were to put it on the entire SharePoint site, everything inside of that site would inherit that retention label, and we would keep it for a period of time, again, whatever the label dictates. We could put it on the site, we could put it on the document library, a folder inside of the SharePoint site, or an individual item. Okay, so we can get very creative here with this, very creative. I do have a couple of customers who have a data classification schedule that says, we keep public data for this amount of time, confidential data for this much time, highly confidential, and obviously you can understand the rest, but that's how they work. So it's important to understand. Now, how can we do this? Well, again, just as we saw with sensitivity labeling, we can do this automatically or manual. Manualing is a little bit difficult of a process, and it's a little bit more difficult for an end user to do. I will be honest with you. However, the automated piece here, very similar to the way sensitivity labels work, is it's looking for the data while it's at rest. It's indexing, and it says, okay, well, we found public data. It's going to have this this retention label applied to it. So maybe it's, hey, it's confidential. We're going to put the confidential retention label on it, and we're going to keep it for 3 years, no matter which service that it's in. So we get the same actions where we can, hold for a period of time, only delete after a period of time, only retain for a period of time. We can get creative with those. There's pretty much the same 4 actions. However, we do get an additional action, which falls into the idea of records management, but we get disposition review. So what we can do here is that we can say confidential data is retained for 3 years, and then we do a disposition. So we set up a disposition review board, and then after 10 years, all data that hits disposition will sit in a disposition review. The disposition review board will get it and say, all right, here's everything that's up for deletion today. Boom, 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 boom. We delete it, or we keep it around. It depends based off of disposition. That board there is the one that actually says, okay, we're thumbing up, get rid of it. We don't need it. Records management is a piece of this here where we got to start talking about what is a record versus what is not a record. A record is a specific term, especially inside of SharePoint. A record is basically a read-only piece of a document. It's been converted to a record, and it will stick around for whatever period of time that has been labeled to stick around for. It is read-only, and you really can't do much with it. It's designed to be a record, and it stays there. Just another option, that starts getting incredibly convoluted, way outside of the scope of anything we should be dealing with here, because this is around event-driven retention, far outside of the scope of this course, just because there's so much involved in that one there. So retention labeling, as I said, very important. However, the last piece I want to talk about here is what drives all of this, eDiscovery. So talked about service-side labeling, retention labeling. So eDiscovery, what is the purpose of it? Well, it's a way for compliance individuals to discover data based on legal criteria. So again, eDiscovery should only be used, this is that ethical piece here, is that eDiscovery should only be used by compliance people. This really should not be an IT thing. I have had in the past where I have seen administrators use eDiscovery as an IT spy tool. I want to look at all the emails that so-and-so is sending, and I want to, get an idea of what they're doing or look at for different things in the organization. Very unethical to do that. It is not a good idea to do that. However, that's nothing necessarily stopping you from doing it unless you have a good governance board, of course. However, when we create an eDiscovery case, everything is a case. So when we're looking at eDiscovery is that this case, think of it as a bucket. Okay, so we create case, case ABC. So this case exists, and everything that is done inside of that case is going to be designed for the actual legal case, the lawsuit or whatever it is, litigation of some sort. So that's all inside of that eDiscovery piece there. That's where we do searches, that's where we do holds, and potentially exports if needed. So everything is done inside of an eDiscovery case, and the cool part about the way that Microsoft has designed eDiscovery here is that we can do delegation. So as we do eDiscovery, we can do these searches and everything, but we can also delegate these out. We say, hey, Mr. Lawyer, here, I'm going to create you this case, and I'm going to delegate this out to you. You do the searches here. Me as an IT person, I should be the furthest away from this stuff. I should not be looking at these things. This is not my job to look at it. My job is to make sure the data works and is flowing and the organization's up and running from an IT perspective. That's not my job to oversee these things here. My job is to enable you to do your job to search for all of this data. You want your, emails from so-and-so to so-and-so during this time period, here you go. You can search for it, your eyes only. Now, there is a lot more to eDiscovery. There is basic, and then there's advanced eDiscovery and such. We're going to look at those. We're just going to do a high-level overview, of course, but we're going to look a lot more of those in lab. So from a perspective of retention and eDiscovery, very big factor here. This is a very, very important piece of this, is because, again, this has to deal with a lot of legalities. And it's very important from an organization, because if you don't follow your policies, your own policies, you're going to run into some problems. So with that being said, we are done here with this particular lecture. We're going to jump into the lab and play around with this here a little bit more. So thank you for your time on this one here, and I'll see you over on the next.